Folklorist uncovers a disturbing image linked to a legend that will haunt you forever, one that seemed to seep into the very bones of Professor Edmund Blackwood as he made his way through the narrow cobblestone streets of Ravenshollow. The small village, nestled deep within the Yorkshire Dales, had remained largely untouched by the modern world, its inhabitants clinging to traditions and superstitions that dated back centuries. Professor Blackwood, a distinguished folklorist from Cambridge University, had come to Ravenshollow following rumours of an extraordinary collection of artefacts housed in the village's ancient manor. Lord Ashworth, the estate's elderly owner, had recently passed away, leaving behind a vast library and collection that his heir was eager to donate to academic institutions before selling the property. The manor itself was an imposing Gothic structure, its weathered stone walls covered in ivy that had turned a deep crimson with the season. Gargoyles perched menacingly along the roofline, their stone eyes seeming to follow Blackwood's every movement as he approached the heavy oak doors. The professor had always been fascinated by such architectural details, seeing in them the physical manifestation of humanity's deepest fears and beliefs. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the late Lord's daughter-in-law, greeted Blackwood at the entrance. She was a woman in her early 50s, with prematurely grey hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that held a perpetual look of worry. Her black mourning dress rustled as she led him through the dimly lit corridors, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to track their movement. Father Ashworth was quite the collector, she explained, her voice echoing in the vast hallway. He spent the better part of 40 years gathering artifacts, manuscripts and curiosities from across Britain and beyond. I'm afraid I haven't the knowledge to properly catalogue everything, which is why I'm so grateful for your assistance, Professor. The library is a magnificent sight to behold. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, packed with leather-bound volumes, rolled parchments, and various artifacts. Ancient Celtic crosses sat alongside medieval manuscripts, while glass cases displayed everything from Roman coins to what appeared to be ritualistic daggers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, mixed with something else, something that made Blackwood's skin crawl, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "Where would you like me to begin?" Blackwood asked, setting down his leather satchel and removing his notebook. Mrs. Ashworth gestured toward a large oak desk, positioned near the room's single window. "Father Ashworth's personal collection is there. He was particularly interested in local folklore and legends. Perhaps you could start with those items?" As Miss Ashworth excused herself to attend to other matters, Blackwood approached the desk with the reverence of a scholar about to uncover hidden treasures. The desktop was covered with various items, old photographs, handwritten notes, sketches, and what appeared to be fragments of much older documents. It was while examining a collection of daguerreotypes that Blackwood first laid eyes on the image that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The photograph was unlike the others, older, more primitive in its composition, and bearing an unsettling quality that made his hands tremble as he held it. The image depicted what appeared to be a ritual gathering in a forest clearing. Figures in dark robes stood in a circle around what looked like an ancient stone altar. But it was the central figure that caused Blackwood's breath to catch in his throat. Tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles, the creature, for lack of a better word, stood behind the altar with its arms raised toward the sky. Most disturbing of all were its eyes. Even in the grainy sepia-toned photograph, they seemed to burn with an otherworldly intelligence, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that made Blackwood feel as though the thing was looking directly at him across the decades. Attached to the photograph was a small piece of parchment with a note written in Lord Ashworth's speedery, handwrite, "Watcher of the Woods, Ravenshollow, 1247. Local legend speaks of a guardian spirit that protects the ancient groves. Villagers claim they appears during times of great change or danger, This photograph was taken by traveling photographer J. Whitmore, who disappeared 3 days after developing the image. Blackwood's academic mind immediately began racing. A photograph from 1847 would make it one of the earliest examples of supernatural documentation in Britain. But more than its historical significance, something about the image itself filled him with an inexplicable dread. He carefully examined the photograph under a magnifying glass, noting details that became even more disturbing upon closer inspection. The robed figures appeared to be villagers. He could make out familiar facial features that resembled some of the people he had encountered in Raven's Hollow that very day. But their expressions were blank, almost vacant, as if they were not entirely present in their own bodies. The creature itself defied easy description. Its limbs were too long, its fingers extending into what looked like claws. Its face, partially obscured by shadow, seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which Blackwood viewed it. Sometimes it appeared almost human. Other times, it looked like something that had never walked among mortals. As evening approached and the library grew darker, Blackwood found himself unable to look away from the photograph. He had spent his entire career studying folklore and legends, approaching them with the detached curiosity of a scholar. But this image challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundary between myth and reality. The sound of Mrs. Ashworth's footsteps in the corridor broke his trance. Quickly, he slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket, along with Lord Ashworth's note. Something told him that this discovery was too important and too dangerous to leave behind. "How are you progressing, Professor?" Mrs. Ashworth asked as she entered the library, carrying a tea service. "Quite well," Blackwood replied, hoping his voice didn't betray the turmoil he felt inside. Lord Ashworth certainly had an impressive collection. "I believe there are several items here that would be of great interest to the university." As they shared tea and discussed the logistics of transferring the collection, Blackwood found his hand unconsciously moving to his jacket pocket, feeling the outline of the photograph beneath the fabric. He knew he should mention it to Miss Ashworth, should ask about its provenance and whether there were any other related materials, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to move differently in the library as night fell, or the feeling that unseen eyes were watching him from the darker corners of the room. Whatever the reason, Blackwood decided to keep his discovery to himself, at least for now. As he prepared to leave the manor that evening, Mrs. Ashworth walked him to the door. "Professor," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I hope you'll be careful with whatever you found here. Father Ashworth always said that some knowledge comes with a price." Blackwood assured that he would handle everything with the utmost care, but as he walked back through the village toward his lodgings at the local inn, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already crossed a line from which there might be no return. The photograph seemed to burn against his chest as he walked, and more than once he thought he glimpsed a tall, thin figure watching him from the shadows between the buildings. But when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there, nothing but the autumn wind rustling through the bare branches of the ancient trees that surrounded Raven's Hollow like silent sentinels. Professor Blackwood spent a restless night at the Raven's Hollow Inn, the photograph hidden beneath his pillow like some guilty secret. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those burning orbs staring back at him from the sepia-toned image. When sleep finally came, it brought with it dreams of dark forests and chanting voices of something ancient and hungry stirring in the depths of the earth. He awoke before dawn, his night clothes damp with perspiration despite the chill in the room. The photograph lay where he had left it, seemingly innocent in the pale morning light, yet still radiating an aura of malevolence that made his skin crawl. After a hasty breakfast, Blackwood made his way to the village small library, housed in a converted chapel that dated back to the librarian, a elderly man named Thomas Hardwell, greeted him with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely received visitors interested in the local archives. "Professor Blackwood, Mrs. Ashworth mentioned you might be stopping by." How can I assist you with your research? Blackwood had prepared a careful explanation. I'm investigating the folklore traditions of this region, particularly any legends or stories that might date back to the mid-19th century. I'm especially interested in tales of supernatural guardians or forest spirits. Hartwell's expression immediately grew more serious. Ah, you're asking about the old stories. Most folks around here don't like to talk about such things anymore. But yes, we have records. Follow me. The librarian led him to a section of the building where the oldest documents were kept. The air here was even more stale and oppressive than in Lord Ashworth's library, heavy with the weight of centuries-old secrets. Here, Hartwell said, pulling out a leather-bound volume, this is a collection of local accounts compiled by the village historian. And this, he added, retrieving another book, contains the official records of unusual incidents reported to the local magistrate. Blackwood spent the morning poring over the documents, taking careful notes. What he discovered both fascinated and disturbed him. The legend of the Watcher of the Woods appeared in various forms throughout the records, dating back at least 3 centuries. According to the earliest accounts, the entity was said to be a guardian spirit that protected the ancient groves surrounding Raven's Hollow. It was described as tall and thin, with an otherworldly appearance that struck fear into the hearts of those who encountered it. Some accounts portrayed it as benevolent, appearing to warn villagers of impending danger. Others described it as malevolent, luring people into the woods never to be seen again. What struck Blackwood as particularly significant was the pattern of sightings. The creature appeared most frequently during times of great change or upheaval, during the plague years of the 16th century, before the Great Fire that destroyed half the village in 1647. But it was an entry from 1847 that made his blood run cold. October 15, 1847, Magistrates report. The photographer J. Whitmore, who arrived in our village 3 days past to document local customs, has been reported missing. His equipment was found abandoned in Thornwick Grove, along with several photographic plates that appear to have been deliberately destroyed. Local residents report seeing strange lights in the forest on the night of his disappearance, accompanied by what they describe as unnatural sounds. Search parties have been organized, but the villagers are reluctant to venture deep into the woods after dark. The matter remains unresolved. Blackwood's hands trembled as he read the entry. This was clearly connected to the photograph he carried, the one supposedly taken by the same Whitmore who had vanished shortly after developing it. But how had Lord Ashworth come to possess the image if the photographer had disappeared? Mr. Hartwell, he called to the librarian, do you know anything about a photographer named Joe Whitmore who went missing? The elderly man looks up from his cataloging work, his expression troubled. Ah, yeah, that's a story that's been passed down in my family. My great-grandfather was part of the search party that looked for him. They never found a body, but he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. What? Well, my great-grandfather always claimed they found something else in those woods, something that made them abandon the search and never speak of it again. It took that secret to his grave, but he did say one thing that always stuck with me. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of research and growing unease. Blackwood discovered references to the Watcher in church records, personal diaries, and even in the margins of official documents, where nervous clerks had scribbled warnings and protective symbols. An account written by a village priest in 1898 was particularly chilling. I have seen the thing that dwells in Thornwick Grove, and I fear for the souls of all who live in its shadow. It is not of this world, nor of the next, but something that exists in the spaces between. It feeds on fear and desperation, growing stronger with each soul it claims. The villagers call it a guardian, but I know better. It is a predator, patient and cunning, waiting for the right moment to strike. God help us all, for I fear our prayers may not be enough to protect us from what we have awakened. As evening approached, Blackwood realized he had been so absorbed in his research that he had forgotten to eat. The library was growing dark, and Hartwell was preparing to close for the night. Professor, The librarian said, as Blackwood gathered his notes. Might I offer you some advice? Of course, whatever you found in Lord Ashworth's collection, whatever brought you here asking these questions, be very careful. This village has kept its secrets for good reason, so my knowledge is too dangerous to possess. Blackwood thanked him and made his way back to the inn, his mind reeling with everything he had learned. The photograph in his pocket seemed heavier now, weighted with the accumulated fear and superstition of generations. As he walked through the village square, he noticed that the streets were unusually empty for early evening. Those few villagers he did encounter quickly averted their eyes and hurried past, as if they could sense that he carried something dark with him. Back in Inn's room, Blackwood spread his notes across the small table and examined the photograph once more under the lamplight. The details seemed even more disturbing now that he understood the context. The robed figures weren't just random cultists. They were villagers, people who had lived and worked in Ravenshollow, somehow compelled to participate in whatever ritual the image depicted. And the creature itself, Blackwood found himself staring into those burning eyes, feeling as though they were looking back at him across the decades. There was an intelligence there, ancient and alien, that seemed to recognize him as more than just a casual observer. As he prepared for bed, Blackwood made a decision that would prove to be fateful. Rather than simply documenting his findings and returning to Cambridge, he would stay in Ravenshollow and investigate further. He needed to understand what the photograph truly depicted, and more importantly, he needed to know if the Watcher of the Woods was still active. Outside his window, the wind picked up, rattling the glass and causing the shadows to dance in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the sound of chanting, faint but unmistakable, carried on the autumn breeze. Blackwood pulled the curtains closed and tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew that his presence in Ravenshollow had not gone unnoticed, and that forces beyond his understanding were already beginning to stir. The next morning brought with it a persistent fog that seemed to cling to the village like a burial shroud. Blackwood awoke to find that the temperature had dropped considerably overnight, and frost covered the windows of his room in intricate patterns that looked almost like ancient script. Determined to learn more about the photograph and the events it depicted, he decided to seek out the oldest residents of Ravenshollow. If anyone remembered stories about the mysterious J. Whitmore or had knowledge of the rituals that took place in Thornwick Grove, it would be the village elders. His first stop was the cottage of Margaret Thornfield, a woman in her 80s who served as the village's unofficial keeper of oral traditions. Her small home sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that had long since succumbed to the autumn chill. Mrs. Thornfield answered the door with obvious reluctance, her rheumy eyes studying Blackwood with suspicion. She was a tiny woman, bent with age, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that suggested a mind still keen, despite her advanced years. "You're the professor from Cambridge?" she said without preamble. "Word travels fast in a village this size. What do you want with an old woman like me?" Blackwood explained his research into local folklore, carefully avoiding any mention of the photograph. Mrs. Thornfield listened in silence, then invited him inside with obvious reluctance. Her cottage was cramped and cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. But what caught Blackwood's attention were the numerous protective charms hanging from the rafters. Iron horseshoes, bundles of rowan twigs, and symbols carved from what looked like very old wood. "You're asking about things that are better left alone," Miss Thornfield said as she prepared tea with shaking hands. "But I suppose if anyone's going to stir up the old troubles, it might as well be someone with education enough to understand the consequences." She settled into a worn armchair by the fireplace and fixed Blackwood with a steady stare. "My grandmother was alive in down here to 47. She told me about the photographer who came to the village, though she made me promise never to repeat the story to anyone else. I'm breaking that promise now, God help me." Blackwood leaned forward, his notebook forgotten in his eagerness to hear her account. Cotta Whitmore wasn't just any photographer, Mrs. Thornfield continued. He was what you might call a seeker, someone who traveled from place to place looking for evidence of the supernatural. He'd heard rumors about Raven's Hollow, about the things that happened in the woods during certain times of the year. What kind of things? The old religion never really died here, Professor. Oh, we built churches and said our prayers. But the older ways ran deep. There were always those who remembered the ancient rites, who knew how to call upon the powers that dwelt in the sacred groves. Mrs. Thornfield paused to sip her tea, her hands trembling slightly. Whitmore arrived during the autumn equinox, when the barrier between worlds grows thin. He claimed he could capture spirits on his photographic plates, that he had done so before in other places. The village elders tried to warn him away, but he wouldn't listen. What happened to him? He got what he was looking for, she said grimly, and it destroyed him. My grandmother was there that night, in Thornwick Grove. She was young then, barely 16, but she was already showing signs of the gift, the ability to see things that others couldn't. Blackwood felt his pulse quicken. She witnessed the ritual? Mrs. Thornfield nodded slowly. The Watcher had been stirring for weeks, appearing to different villagers in dreams and visions. It was calling for a ceremony, demanding acknowledgement of its power. Some of the older families, those who remembered the old ways, felt compelled to answer. And Whitmore photographed the ceremony? It tried to, but the moment his camera captured the Watcher's image, something changed. The creature became aware of him, aware that its essence had been trapped in his device. It reached out across the clearing and... She shuddered. My grandmother said she saw Whitmore's soul leave his body, drawn into the photograph itself. His body collapsed, but the Watcher wasn't finished with him. Mrs. Thornfield stood and moved to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she withdrew a yellowed piece of paper covered in faded ink. My grandmother wrote down what she saw that night, though she regretted it for the rest of her life. She said the knowledge burned inside her like a fever until she put it on paper. Blackwood accepted the document with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in great distress. The photographer's body rose from the ground, but it was no longer his. The Watcher had taken residence within his flesh, using it as a vessel to walk among us. For 3 days, the thing that wore Whitmore's face moved through our village, speaking to people, learning our secrets, feeding on our fears. It was only when the village priest performed an exorcism that the creature was banished back to the grove, leaving behind only an empty shell that crumbled to dust. But the photograph survived, Blackwood whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Thornfield. The old woman's eyes widened. How did you? She stopped herself, studying his face intently. You've seen it, haven't you? You've found Whitmore's cursed image. Blackwood hesitated, then slowly withdrew the photograph from his jacket pocket. Mrs. Thornfield recoiled as if he had produced a venomous snake. Put that away, she hissed. Do you have any idea what you've done by bringing that thing here? I'm trying to understand. You're trying to get us all killed. She backed away from him, her face pale with terror. That photograph is a doorway, Professor. Every time someone looks at it, they create a connection with the Watcher. And the more it's viewed, the stronger that connection becomes. Blackwood quickly returned the photograph to his pocket, but the damage was done. Miss Thornfield was now pressed against the far wall of her cottage, her hands clutched to her chest. You have to destroy it, she whispered, before it's too late, before the Watcher finds a way to use that connection to return to our world. How? Blackwood asked. How do I destroy it? Fire, she said without hesitation. Burn it in a place of power, somewhere the old protections still hold. The church might work, or... She paused, considering. There's a stone circle in the hills above the village. It's older than Raven's Hollow itself, older than Christianity. If you can reach it before the Watcher realizes what you're doing, you might be able to sever the connection. Blackwood thanked her and prepared to leave, But Mrs. Thornfield grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Professor," she said urgently, "whatever you do, don't look at that photograph again. Every viewing makes the connection stronger, and I fear you may have already seen it too many times. The Watcher knows you exist now, and it will do everything in its power to prevent you from destroying its anchor to our world." As Blackwood left the cottage, he noticed that the fog had grown thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards. The valley seemed eerily quiet, as if all life had suddenly vanished. Even the usual sounds of daily activity, children playing, dogs barking, the clip-clop of horses were absent. He made his way through the empty streets, planning to visit other elderly residents to corroborate Mrs. Thornfield's story. But as he walked, he began to notice that he was not alone in the fog. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, keeping pace with him, but always staying just out of sight. When he reached the village square, Blackwood stopped and turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source of his unease. The fog swirled around him like a living thing, and for a moment he thought he saw a tall, thin figure standing near the old well at the center of the square. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving him to wonder if his mind was already beginning to succumb to the photograph's influence. The weight of the cursed image in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, and Blackwood realized that Mrs. Thornfield was right. He had to destroy the photograph before it destroyed him and possibly the entire village of Raven's Hollow. That evening, Blackwood barricaded himself in his room at the inn, determined not to look at the photograph again, despite the overwhelming compulsion to do so. The cursed image seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in his jacket pocket, calling to him with a siren song that grew stronger as the hours passed. He tried to focus on his research, spreading his notes across the small table and attempting to piece together a complete picture of the Watcher's history. But concentration proved impossible. Every shadow in the room seemed to move independently, and the fog outside his window had grown so thick that it pressed against the glass like seeking fingers. Around midnight, Blackwood heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped directly outside his door. He held his breath, waiting for a knock that never came. Instead, he heard a voice, barely above a whisper, speaking his name. "Professor Blackwood." The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, ancient and hollow, like wind through a tomb. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Professor Blackwood, we know you have what belongs to us." Against every instinct, screaming at him to remain silent, Blackwood found himself drawn to the door. His hand moved toward the handle of its own accord, and only a supreme effort of will prevented him from opening it. "Give us back our image, Professor. Give us back our anchor to your world." The voice faded, and the footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor. But Blackwood knew that whatever had been outside his door was not gone. It was simply waiting. He spent the remainder of the night sitting in a chair facing the door, a poker from the fireplace clutched in his hands. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the burning gaze of the Watcher, staring back at him from the photograph. Dawn brought little relief. The fog had not lifted, and if anything, it seemed to have grown denser overnight. When Blackwood ventured downstairs for breakfast, he found the inn's common room empty, except for the proprietor, a nervous man named William Hodges. "Terrible weather we're having," Hodges said, his voice strained. "Can't remember the last time we had fog this thick. Most of the villagers are staying indoors until it clears." But Blackwood could see the truth in the man's eyes. This wasn't ordinary weather. It was something far more sinister. The Watcher's influence was spreading, using the fog as a veil to move freely through the village. After a hasty breakfast, Blackwood set out for the stone circle Mrs. Thornfield had mentioned. According to his map, it lay approximately 2 miles north of the village, on a hill that offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside. If he could reach it and destroy the photograph there, he might be able to break the connection before it was too late. The journey through the fog-shrouded landscape was like walking through a nightmare. Familiar landmarks disappeared and reappeared in unexpected places, as if the very geography of the region was shifting around him. More than once, it was certain he was walking in circles, only to suddenly find himself on a path he didn't recognize. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional rustle of unseen movement in the fog. But gradually, other sounds began to intrude, whispers in a language he didn't recognize, the distant sound of chanting, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. As he climbed higher into the hills, the fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the landscape around him. What he saw filled him with dread. The trees were wrong, twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The grass beneath his feet had turned black, as if scorched by some invisible fire, and everywhere carved into tree trunks and scratched into stones were symbols that hurt to look at that directly. They seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, suggesting meanings that his rational mind refused to accept. The stone circle, when he finally reached it, was both magnificent and terrifying. 12 massive monoliths stood in a perfect ring, each one covered in carvings that predated any known civilization. At the center of the circle was a flat altar stone, stained dark with what Blackwood preferred not to identify, but it was what surrounded the circle that made his blood run cold. Dozens of figures stood motionless in the fog, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They had been waiting for him. As Blackwood approached the circle, the figures began to move, forming a larger ring around the ancient stones. Their movements were synchronized as if controlled by a single will, and when they began to chant, their voices blended into a harmony that seemed to resonate in his very bones. At the center of the stone circle, a familiar figure materialized from the fog. Tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and burning eyes, the Watcher of the Woods stood waiting for him. But this was not the creature from the photograph. This was something far more terrible, a being that had grown stronger with each viewing of its captured image. Professor Blackwood, the creature spoke, its voice echoing from multiple directions at once. You have served us well. Through your research, through your obsession with our image, you have opened the doorway we needed. Blackwood reached into his pocket for the photograph, intending to throw it into the fire he had prepared to build at the altar. But his hand encountered only empty fabric. The photograph was gone. The Watcher's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. Did you think we would allow you to destroy our anchor so easily? The image is safe, Professor, and through it we will spread our influence far beyond this small village. Where is it? Blackwood demanded, though he already suspected the answer. Your colleague at Cambridge received the most interesting package this morning, the Watcher replied. Professor Hartwell was so excited to receive what he believed to be a significant historical document. By now, he has no doubt shared it with his students, his fellow academics. Each viewing creates a new connection, a new pathway for our power. The horror of what he had done crashed over Blackwood like a physical blow. In Hill's eagerness to share his discovery, he had mailed copies of the photograph to his colleagues, along with detailed notes about its supposed historical significance. He had unknowingly become an agent of the very entity he sought to destroy. You see, Professor, the Watcher continued, you were never meant to destroy the photograph. You were meant to spread it. Your academic credentials, your reputation, they gave our image the legitimacy it needed to reach a wider audience. The chanting of the hooded figures grew louder, and Blackwood realized that the fog was not natural weather, but the manifestation of the Watcher's growing power. With each new viewing of the photograph, the creature's influence expanded, allowing it to reach further into the world beyond Raven's Hollow. What do you want? Blackwood asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. What we have always wanted, the Watcher replied, to reclaim our rightful place as guardians of this world. Humanity has forgotten the old ways, forgotten the proper respect due to beings such as ourselves. Through our image we will remind them. The hooded figures began to close in, and Blackwood realized that his academic curiosity had doomed not just himself, but potentially countless others. The photograph was no longer just in Cambridge by now. It could be anywhere, spreading like a virus through the academic community and beyond. As the circle of figures tightened around him, Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to undo the damage he had caused. He pulled out his notebook and began tearing out pages, throwing them toward the altar stone. "My research," he shouted. "If I destroy my notes, if I eliminate the academic context, perhaps the photograph will lose its power." But the watcher only laughed again. "Too late, Professor. The seed has been planted and it has already begun to grow. Your notes were helpful, but they are no longer necessary." The hooded figures reached the stone circle, and Blackwood could see their faces clearly for the first time. They were villagers from Raven's Hollow, people he had spoken with, people who had seemed perfectly normal just days before. But their eyes were empty now, reflecting the same burning intelligence he had seen in the Watcher's gaze. "Join us, Professor," the creature said, extending one impossibly long arm toward him. "You have served us faithfully, and we would reward that service. Become one of our vessels, and you will witness the transformation of your world." Blackwood backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The circle of possessed villagers had closed completely, and beyond them the fog stretched endlessly in all directions. As the Watcher's hand reached for him, Blackwood's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone, somewhere, would recognize the danger the photograph represented and find a way to stop its spread before it was too late. But even as darkness claimed him, he knew that his prayer would likely go unanswered. The academic world was too eager for new discoveries, too willing to share interesting findings, without considering the consequences. The Watcher of the Woods had chosen its vessel well. 3 weeks after Professor Blackwood's disappearance from Raven's Hollow, the photograph had already begun its insidious journey through the academic world. Charles Hartwell, Blackwood's colleague at Cambridge, had indeed received the package with great excitement, viewing it as a significant contribution to the university's folklore collection. The photograph was first displayed during a lecture on supernatural photography in Victorian Britain, where 37 students and faculty members viewed it with fascination. Hartwell, unaware of the true nature of what he was presenting, encouraged detailed examination of the image, pointing out the remarkable clarity of the central figure and the apparent authenticity of the scene. Among those in attendance was Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a graduate student researching her family genealogy. The surname of the photographer had caught her attention, and she approached Dr. Hartwell after the lecture to request a copy of the image for her personal research. She explained, attempting to trace the fate of her great-great-uncle, one Joe Whitmore, who had disappeared while working as a traveling photographer in the Hartwell, delighted to assist in what seemed like a touching family mystery, provided Miss Whitmore with a high-quality reproduction of the photograph, along with copies of Professor Blackwood's notes. Within days, she had shared the image with family members across England, each viewing adding another thread to the web of connections the Watcher was weaving. The photograph's influence manifested differently in each view. Some experienced vivid nightmares featuring dark forests and chanting voices. Others found themselves inexplicably drawn to isolated woodland areas, particularly during the hours between sunset and dawn. A few reported seeing tall, thin figures watching them from the shadows, always just at the edge of perception. Margaret Ashford, a psychologist at London's Bethlehem Hospital, first encountered the photograph when it was brought to her by a patient, a young man named Timothy Marsh, who claimed the image was calling to him and causing him to lose time. Ashford initially dismissed his concerns as symptoms of his existing condition, but when she examined the photograph herself, she found it strangely compelling. That night, Dr. Ashford, experienced her first vision. She found herself standing in a moonlit forest clearing, surrounded by hooded figures who chanted in a language that seemed familiar despite being completely unknown to her. At the center of the clearing stood the creature from the photograph, its burning eyes fixed directly on her. As for it spoke, its voice echoing inside her mind rather than through her ears. You understand the human psyche better than most. You will help us reach those who are most vulnerable, most susceptible to our warnings. When she awoke, Asfor found the tiny notes in her own handwriting, describing methods for using the photograph as a therapeutic tool. The notes suggested that the image could be used to help patients confront their deepest fears, to break through psychological barriers that traditional therapy could not address. Despite a nagging sense that something was terribly wrong, Dr. Ashford found herself implementing these techniques with her patients. The results were remarkable and disturbing. Patients who viewed the photograph while in vulnerable psychological states reported profound experiences, claiming to have communicated with entities beyond human understanding. But these breakthroughs came at a cost. Several patients disappeared from the hospital, leaving behind only empty beds and windows that had been opened from the inside. Security footage showed them walking calmly out of the building in the middle of the night, their faces blank and their movements unnaturally synchronized. Meanwhile, in the village of Ravens Hollow, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The fog that had descended during Professor Blackwood's final days had never lifted, and the village had effectively been cut off from the outside world. Mail deliveries had stopped, telephone lines had gone dead, and the railway station had been abandoned after the last train to arrive had departed, empty, its passengers and crew nowhere to be found. Miss Cordelia Ashworth, who had first welcomed Professor Blackwood to her father-in-law's manor, was among the last to resist the Watcher's influence. She had barricaded herself in the manor's library, surrounded by protective symbols she had found in her father-in-law's collection. But even these ancient wards were beginning to fail. Through the library windows, she could see the villagers moving through the fog-shrouded streets. They walked in perfect formation, their movement coordinated as if they were parts of a single organism. During the day, they appeared to go about their normal activities, tending shops, caring for animals, maintaining their homes, but at night, they gathered in the village square and stood motionless until dawn, their faces turned toward the sky as if receiving instructions from some unseen source. Mrs. Ashworth had tried to send word to the outside world, but every messenger she dispatched either returned with no memory of their mission or failed to return at all. She was beginning to realize that Ravens Hollow had become something more than just an isolated village. It had become a staging ground for something far more sinister. In London, the photograph continued to spread through academic and social circles. Art collectors began bidding on reproductions, viewing the image as a fascinating example of early supernatural photography. Newspapers picked up the story, running articles about the mysterious Victorian photograph that had captured what appeared to be an authentic supernatural encounter. Each article included a reproduction of the image, exposing thousands of readers to its influence. The Watcher's power grew with each viewing, and its ability to reach across vast distances increased proportionally. Reports began to surface of strange incidents in cities across Britain, unexplained disappearances, mass sleepwalking events, and sightings of impossibly tall figures in urban areas where such beings should not exist. Hamish Whitfield, a researcher at the British Museum, became one of the photograph's most effective unwitting agents, convinced that the image represented a breakthrough in the documentation of folklore traditions. He arranged for it to be displayed in a special exhibition on supernatural Britain. The exhibition drew thousands of visitors over its 6-week run, each one carrying away a piece of the Watcher's influence. But it was the museum's decision to create postcards featuring the photograph that truly accelerated its spread. These postcards were sold in gift shops, mailed to friends and family members, and collected by enthusiasts of the macabre. Within months, Copies of the image had reached every corner of the British Isles and had begun to appear in other countries as well. The Watcher's influence adapted to each new environment it encountered. In urban areas, it manifested as a sense of being watched from tall buildings and dark alleyways. In rural regions, it appeared in the traditional form of a forest guardian, alluring people into isolated areas where they could be more easily influenced. Those who fell under its sway didn't simply disappear. They became agents of its will, spreading the photograph's influence while maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior. They took positions in publishing houses, museums, libraries, and other institutions where they could ensure the image's continued circulation. By the winter of 1912, less than 6 months after Professor Blackwood's fateful discovery, the photograph had become one of the most widely reproduced images in Britain. It appeared in academic journals, popular magazines, and even children's books about ghosts and legends. And with each new reproduction, with each additional viewing, the Watcher of the Woods grew stronger, its ancient power spreading like a contagion through the modern world. The creature that had once been confined to a small Yorkshire village was now poised to reclaim its dominion over humanity, one photograph at a time. The stage was set for the final phase of its plan, a plan that would transform not just Britain, but the entire world into a realm where the old powers once again held sway over the affairs of mortals. By the spring of 1930, the photograph's influence had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What had begun as an academic curiosity in a small Yorkshire village had become a phenomenon that was reshaping the very fabric of British society. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came from the census office in London. Clerks working on population statistics noticed an alarming trend. Entire communities were reporting identical behavioral patterns. Villagers across the country were abandoning their homes during the same lunar phases, gathering in ancient stone circles in sacred groves that had been forgotten for centuries. Detective Inspector William Morrison of Scotland Yard was assigned to investigate what the press had begun calling the Great Sleepwalking. His initial assumption was that some form of mass hysteria was affecting rural populations, perhaps triggered by economic hardship or social unrest. But as Morrison delved deeper into the cases, he discovered a disturbing common thread. In every affected community, someone had recently acquired a copy of what was being called the Raven's Hollow photograph. The image had become so ubiquitous that it was being sold as a curiosity in shops across London, often accompanied by sensationalized stories about its supernatural origins. Morrison's investigation led him to Margaret Ashford, who had been committed to her own hospital after suffering what colleagues described as a complete psychological breakdown. When Morrison interviewed her, he found a woman consumed by guilt and terror, desperately trying to warn anyone who would listen about the true nature of the photograph. "It's not just an image," she whispered, her hands shaking as she spoke. "It's a doorway. Every time someone looks at it, they create a connection with something that should never have been allowed into our world. I helped it spread, God forgive me. I used it on my patients, thinking I was helping them." Ashford's medical notes provided Morrison with his first real understanding of the photograph's effects. She had documented how prolonged exposure to the image caused progressive changes in brain activity, particularly in regions associated with free will and independent thought. Subjects became increasingly susceptible to external influence, eventually losing the ability to act according to their own desires. "They're still human," she explained, "but they're no longer in control of their own minds." The thing in the photograph, the Watcher, it's using them as extensions of itself. And the more people who see the image, the stronger it becomes. Morrison's investigation took him to Raven's Hollow, though reaching the village proved nearly impossible. The fog that had descended months earlier had never lifted, and the surrounding roads had become treacherous, with travelers reporting that familiar landmarks would suddenly appear in impossible locations. When Morrison finally reached the village, he found it transformed into something from a nightmare. The buildings remained intact, but they were arranged differently, as if the entire settlement had been reconstructed according to some alien geometry. The villagers moved through the streets in perfect synchronization, their faces blank and their eyes reflecting the same burning intelligence Morrison had seen in the photograph. At the center of the village square stood a new structure, a towering obelisk carved from black stone and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around this base, dozens of photographs were arranged in a complex pattern, each one a reproduction of the original image that Professor Blackwood had discovered. But it was what Morrison found in Lord Ashworth's manor that truly revealed the scope of the threat. The library had been transformed into a kind of command center, its walls covered with maps showing the photographs spread across Britain and beyond. Red pins marked the locations where the image had appeared, connected by lines that formed a vast web stretching across the country. Miss Cordelia Ashworth was still there, but she was no longer the frightened woman who had first welcomed Professor Blackwood. Her eyes now burned with the same otherworldly intelligence as the other villagers, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Morrison's bone. "Inspector Morrison," she said, though he had not introduced himself, "you're too late to stop what has already begun. The Watcher has reclaimed its rightful place in this world, and soon all of humanity will remember the proper order of things." She gestured to a large map of Europe, where new pins were appearing even as Morrison watched. "The photograph has reached the continent now. Paris, Berlin, Rome, all felt the Watcher's touch. And soon it will cross the ocean to the New World." Morrison tried to answer, but found himself unable to move. The symbols carved into the manor's walls seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and he realized that the building itself had become a focus for the Watcher's power. "You have a choice, Inspector," Mrs. Ashworth continued. "You can join us willingly and help guide humanity through the transition that is coming. Or you can resist and be swept aside when the old powers fully return." Morrison managed to break free from whatever force was holding him and fled the manor, but not before grabbing several of the photographs from the walls. If he could understand how the image worked, perhaps he could find a way to counter its effect. Back in London, Morrison sought out experts in various fields, hoping to find someone who could explain the photograph's power from a scientific perspective. Nigel Pemberton, a researcher in the emerging field of psychology, suggested that the image might be triggering some form of mass hypnosis, exploiting weaknesses in human perception that allowed for external control. But it was Father Michael O'Brien, an elderly priest who specialized in what the church quietly called unusual phenomena, who provided Morrison with the most useful insight. "What you're describing," Father O'Brien said, after examining one of the photographs, "sounds like what medieval scholars called a scrying glass, a tool that allows entities from other realms to observe and influence our world. But this is far more sophisticated than anything I've encountered before." The priest's research led Morrison to ancient texts that describe similar incidents throughout history, images or objects that served as anchors for otherworldly beings seeking to establish footholds in the material world. In every case, the only effective countermeasure had been the complete destruction of the anchor object and all copies of it. But that's impossible now, Morrison realized. There must be thousands of copies in circulation. We could never find them all. Father O'Brien nodded grimly. "Which means we may be facing something unprecedented. The successful invasion of our reality by a force that operates according to rules we don't understand." As if to confirm his fears, reports began arriving from across the British Empire. Colonial administrators in India, Australia, and Canada reported strange incidents involving photographs that had been shipped from London. Native populations who had maintained their own traditions of spiritual protection were proving more resistant to the image's influence, but even they were beginning to succumb. The photograph had become more than just an image. It had become a virus of consciousness, spreading through the networks of communication and commerce that connected the modern world. And with each new infection, the Watcher's power grew stronger. Morrison's final report to his superiors was classified immediately and buried in the deepest archives of Scotland Yard. In it, he recommended the complete suppression of all information related to the Ravens Hollow photograph and the implementation of emergency measures to prevent its further spread. But even as he wrote his recommendations, Morrison knew they would be ineffective. The photograph had already achieved a critical mass of distribution, and the forces it had unleashed were beyond the power of any human institution to control. The last entry in Morrison's journal, found after his own disappearance 3 days later, reads simply, "The Watcher is no longer confined to the photograph. It walks among us now, wearing human faces and speaking with human voices. God help us all, for we have opened a door that can never be closed." By the end of 1903, the photograph had spread to every corner of the civilized world, carrying with it the influence of an entity that had waited centuries for the opportunity to reclaim its dominion over humanity. The Watcher of the Woods had achieved its goal, not through force or violence, but through humanity's own curiosity and desire to share knowledge. In seeking to document and understand the supernatural, Professor Blackwood had inadvertently provided it with the perfect tool for conquest. And in the years that followed, as the world descended into unprecedented conflict and chaos, few would recognize that the seeds of that destruction had been planted by a single photograph discovered in a dusty library in a forgotten Yorkshire village by a folklorist who had simply wanted to preserve the old stories for future generations. The old powers had returned, and the age of human dominion was drawing to a close. Epilogue. In 1952, nearly 40 years after the events in Ravens Hollow, a young archivist named Sarah Mitchell discovered a sealed box in the basement of the British Museum. Inside, she found a collection of photographs, documents, and a journal belonging to Detective Inspector William Morris. As she examined the materials by lamplight, Sarah was struck by the central photograph, a haunting image of robed figures gathered around what appeared to be some kind of ritual. The tall, thin creature at the center of the scene seemed to stare directly at her, its eyes burning with an intelligence that transcended the limitations of the photographic medium. Despite the warning scrawled in Morrison's journal, despite the obvious fear that had driven him to hide these materials away, Sarah found herself unable to look away from the image. There was something compelling about it, something that spoke to a deep part of her consciousness that rational thought could not reach. The next morning she made copies of the photograph to share with her colleagues, thinking it would make an interesting addition to the museum's collection of supernatural artifacts. After all, what harm could there be in preserving such a fascinating piece of history? The cycle began anew.